do a survey. Oh, going to do a survey of these Old Testament books, and I've got a PowerPoint, so you should be seeing me and also the PowerPoint at the same time. And there's a lot of material to get through tonight. If we don't get through to Esther, in the will of God, we'll get through it next week with the next one. So um, anyway, I'll share this PowerPoint, and then we'll get cracking. All right. So we're looking at the historical books, which goes from Joshua through to Esther. And my purpose really is I really want us to understand something of the structure of these books and the flow of thought that is in these books. And so if you could, that would be really wonderful. So the first thing we're going to look at is the book of Joshua. And I've got a purpose statement at the beginning, and I've got two purposes for the book of Joshua. Firstly, it teaches us how God fulfilled his promise to give Canaan as an inheritance to Israel. Secondly, it teaches the importance of living by faith, by relying on the promises of God, because they took the land by faith. And just dividing up this book here, the first thing we find with Joshua is that they were entering the land. And in terms of entering the land, someone as a pessimist might look at the beginning of Joshua and say, well, Moses has died and Joshua has big sandals to fill. There's the Jordan River and it's in flood. And the pessimist might say, well, it's no good. But God gives a lot of encouragement in these first 5 chapters up to verse 12. He gives encouragement first to Joshua in the first chapter, speaking promises of his presence with him. And that's what we need, his presence with us as well when we do God's work. In chapter 2, there's encouragement from an unusual source. The encouragement is actually from Rahab. And when the spies go to her in verse 9 through verse 11, listen to what it said. And she said unto the men, I know the Lord hath given you the land, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when we came out of Egypt, and what you did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above, in the earth beneath. Well, what an encouraging report to bring back to the children of Israel. God encourages them as they pass through the Jordan. It's in flood. They pass through it, but God puts his blessing on Joshua. And in Joshua 4:14, on that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life. But we also read there the effect on the people of Canaan. In Joshua 5 and verse 1, we read this, and it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel until we were passed over, that their hearts melted, neither was any spirit in them any more because of the children of Israel. And this allowed Joshua and the children of Israel, the sign of the Abrahamic covenant was circumcision. And right there, before the enemy, as it were, they were circumcised. The nation was circumcised when they came out of the land of Egypt, and they were circumcised when they went to fight against the Canaanites. But there they celebrated also 40 years exactly the Passover, the first Passover in the land. So that's entering the land. It's a period of great encouragement. And then we come to conquering the land, and there's a little incident at the end of chapter 5 which sets the stage for all that happens after this, because what happens is that it's a pre-incarnate appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ as the captain of the host, the commander of the Lord's armies. And his presence, he comes with sword drawn, and he comes there, and his presence is vital for the victory that will happen in the following chapters. Well, what happens next is from chapter 6 through chapter 9, there's the central campaign. And although this is under God's direction, we see there's a lot of perhaps wisdom and strategy there. They enter into the center of the nation, and it divides the Canaanite tribes in the north and the Canaanite tribes in the south. And going into Jericho, it seemed like a very unusual strategy to deploy, marching around the city. And with that, it was what God told them to do, and they believed God, and they were victorious. And they needed the presence of God, because right away in chapter 7, when Achan sinned, there was disobedience to God, and it was only when that was righted that God gave them victory, when they went against Ai and had the battle there. They needed the Lord's help also when the Gibeonites came against them and deceived them. They didn't seek the Lord in prayer. Well, when we're fighting a spiritual battle, we need need prayer with spiritual warfare. Well, that's the central campaign, and now there's the southern campaign. And in chapter 10, a number of kings in the south, Jerusalem and the surrounds, come against Joshua and the armies. And God encourages them, Joshua 10:8, and the Lord said unto Joshua, fear them not, for I have delivered them into thine hand. There shall not a man of them stand before thee. The Lord also had the sun and the moon stand still so he could give the victory. And the people of Canaan, of course, worshipped the sun and the moon, so it must have been very, very impressive when the sun and the moon stood still. And then in chapter 11, there's the northern campaign. And the challenge in the north is even greater, because the challenge in the north is greater because the armies up there have chariots. Well, the Lord is sufficient no matter what the difficulties, and the armies in the north are overcome. And Joshua, it's said in chapter 11, verse 15, he left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. Obedience is the source of blessing. Well, in chapter 12, there were 31 kings that were defeated, which brings us to our third point in the book of Joshua, and dividing the land. And with dividing the land, I want to point out two things. Firstly, is from a prophetic point of view. Under Joshua, they never conquered the land in terms of what God promised them in terms of the Abrahamic covenant. Nor did this happen under David, nor of Solomon, but it will happen under the Lord Jesus Christ when he comes back to reign, and they will have possession of all that God promised them under Abraham. But in these chapters in the dividing of the land, there's also signs of bad things to come. And the signs of bad things to come are unbelief. And right there in Joshua 17, verse 12 and 13, it speaks of failure. That the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites would dwell in their land. Yet it came to pass, when the children of Israel were waxen strong, that they put the Canaanites to tribute, but they did not utterly drive them out. Which brings us to the fourth point, which is dwelling in the land. And there's almost a civil war at the end as the 2.5 tribes return to the other side of the Jordan, but it shows that both sides wanted to do what was pleasing to God. And Joshua also gives he gives an address to the nation in chapter 23, and in chapter 24 there's a renewal of the covenant, when there is a great desire among the people that they might serve the Lord. Which brings us to the book of Judges. And when we come to the book of Judges, we have we'll divide this up into three particular sections. What's important in terms of understanding the book of Judges is that there is an introduction and a conclusion. There's what we call a prologue and there's an epilogue. And those two, as we're going to see in a moment, connect, and it's vital to see the connection. And with the prologue and the epilogue, they both divide into two sections. And in chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 5, we read of the failure of the children of Israel to fight holy war, to completely annihilate the Canaanites as they were promised. Remember that point. And then from chapter 2, verse 6 to chapter 3, verse 6, we have there Israel's idolatry, and it's a summary of the whole book. It shows the cycles of the judges, but it shows how the children of Israel were given over to idolatry. Keep that on the back burner from when we come to the epilogue at the end of the book. Well, the second point that we need to make is we find deliverers. And in this section, the big section of the book, we find deliverers, and there's this cycle which we've just spoken about where Israel would fall away, then they'd cry out to the Lord, God would raise up a deliverer, and that there would be this deliverance. But in terms of the deliverers, they start at the best, and there's a downhill slide. Some are major judges, some are minor judges. Othniel is the first judge, and he captures Debir by faith, but nothing bad is said about Othniel. And then it comes to Ehud. Ehud's the next major judge, but in Ehud works a great deliverance, but when he works a great deliverance, he does it by deception, which brings us to the first minor judge, which is Shamgar. And Shamgar, there's a bit of mystery about him because Shamgar's name is not a Hebrew name. It's not even certain if he's an Israelite. Is he an Israelite, or is it with a foreign name, or is he a foreigner? But whatever he was, he brought about a great deliverance. He's not called a judge, but he is a deliverer. Which brings us to Deborah and Barak. Again, we come to major judges, and here they are together. And Deborah judges Israel in the sense that she decides cases. People bring their complaints, problems to Deborah, but she won't lead the children of Israel in battle. And so Barak is given that responsibility. Well, Barak, when we look at him, he is very apprehensive about going into battle. He's very uncertain, and he needs to be encouraged. Well, we can be a little bit like that in terms of faith ventures as well, but you can see in terms of the judges that there's something of a decline. And then we come to Gideon. Well, Barak was apprehensive, and Gideon, he is very apprehensive, and he's continually talking with God and even testing God, as it were, twice because of his uncertainty to go into battle. He is a man of faith, but he's apprehensive. And at the end of the incident, the history of Gideon, he makes an ephod, and with that ephod, he causes his family to go astray. It turns into an idol. With Gideon, his son is Abimelech, and he seeks to be a king, but God is king of the nation of Israel. But with Abimelech, the thing that we find is usually there is a problem from the outside, but with Abimelech, there's a problem from inside the nation. Well, after Abimelech, we come to not one minor judge, but two minor judges. And very little is said about them except for Yair, it says of him he had 30 sons, 30 ass colts, and 30 cities, which suggests polygamy and perhaps a desire to accrue wealth. Two minor judges passed over quickly. Well, we come now to Jephthah. And Jephthah works a mighty deliverance, but he makes a very rash vow. And when he makes the rash vow, from the Hebrew we understand that he uses masculine pronouns. He wasn't expecting his daughter to come out the door. Many students of the Bible, but Jewish interpreters and many older interpreters thought that, and some modern interpreters thought that he offered his daughter as a burnt sacrifice. But I don't think that, because I think it would, for a number of reasons, but I think, why would she bewail her virginity for 2 months when she's going to die? Rather, she would bewail the fact that she's going to die. But we see, the point is, he makes this rash vow, and we see a decline with the judges. After this, there are 3 minor judges, and very little is mentioned of them, except they had large families, but nothing is mentioned of them regarding their delivering the nation. And curiously, the last one is buried among the Amalekites. Well, the last major judge is Samson. And what's interesting is now the cycles of Israel turning away from the Lord, and they're calling out to the Lord, and God raising up a deliverer, it's not there. And with Samson, God raises up from birth one who would be the judge. But he is a man of faith, but he's morally questionable, as it were. And what we find is that Samson loved foreign women, and he was strongly motivated by revenge. But he does trust God at the end. That overview, in terms of to look at the decline that happened during the days of the judges, which brings us to the epilogue. Remember, the second point in the prologue was that Israel were given over to idolatry. In the first part of the prologue, in chapter 17 and 18, we find individuals there given over to idolatry in the nation. And there's 2 statements in chapter 17 verse 6 and 18 verse 1. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. There was no king in Israel. And some take that to be a human king, but I think preeminently God was meant to be their king. And when God wasn't their king, as it were, it turned to anarchy and idolatry in the nation. And then we also find that the last section of the epilogue, in the beginning of Judges, we found that they were disobedient to Deuteronomy 7 and didn't launch a holy war annihilating the people of the Canaanites. Now in the last 3 chapters, that's inverted, where they launch on bad information and bad applying of the scriptures, a holy war against the Benjamites. It's descriptive of their turning away from God, and again the refrain, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. I should have put up, that's a very dark section of the Bible, and we call that degradation. Which brings us to the book of Ruth. And with the book of Ruth, I put the purpose of the book of Ruth is to tell how God used human love to display his providence and achieve his plan of redemption. And we divide Ruth up just according to each chapter. And we have in the first chapter, we have Ruth choosing. And this, we've got to remind ourselves, we like to turn from the book of Judges to the book of Ruth because Ruth is in the days of the Judges, but after the darkness of the Judges, this is a very beautiful and delightful story to read about what God did there in Israel. And it doesn't start in a good way because there's a drought in the land. God had brought his chastisement on the nation. And this family, of course, they go away to Moab. And the end result of it is that Naomi is left without a husband, and her two daughters-in-law are left without husband, and she has no means of providing for herself. That's the important part at the beginning. And so providentially, she hears that God has visited his people. And God has visited his people, and she goes to return to the land of Israel. And when she goes to the land of Israel, there is no, her two daughters-in-law decide to go with her. And Orpah, of course, Naomi makes clear that there is, for Orpah, no husband, no children, so she returns to her family and God's. Well, Ruth makes a glorious and beautiful confession of faith and commitment, and without taking away from the beautiful confession, we sometimes talk about counting the cost. And when she makes that beautiful confession, there is a cost for Ruth, because there she would go to a life that's uncertain, probably a life of poverty, probably a life without a husband, and probably a life when Naomi dies, very, very uncertain. So it's a beautiful confession, but against the background of a costly confession. Well, when Naomi gets back there to the land, she is ashamed. She has nothing. Her husband's gone. She has no sons left. And she describes herself in terms of, in the Exodus, her life had been made very bitter. And that's the end of chapter 1. Things don't look good for Naomi. Well, the bright thing is we had chapter 2, we have Ruth serving. And at the beginning of the chapter, it describes in the King James Bible as Boaz as a mighty man of wealth. Literally, he's a mighty man of valor. And as a mighty man of valor, he's outstanding in every way. He's outstanding in the community. He's a very honored kind of man. And in the providence of God, Ruth finds herself right there in the fields of Boaz. Well, chapter 2 gives a testimony of Ruth. It speaks of her hard work. And the testimony of Ruth also speaks of her testimony regarding Naomi became well known amongst all the community. And there's a testimony also of Boaz, because Boaz treats her so well. Not only does he put her in a convenient place in terms of her gleaning, but what he does is she doesn't even have to draw the water. He invites her to eat with him, and he even shares a meal with her with his own hand. This is an extraordinary honor that Boaz gives to Ruth. Well, when in chapter 2, Ruth goes back home and tells Naomi, Naomi is very interested. And the key, of course, is in verse 20, when we learn that he is a near kinsman, and a kinsman could have an important responsibility in helping one who had fallen into economic difficulty. Which brings us to chapter 3, Ruth is resting. And Naomi, the brain has been twirling over in her mind, and she comes up with a strategy, and it's a daring proposal for this solution. And so she sends Ruth, knowing that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, and the law was designed to prevent the extinction of any family in the land of Israel. And Ruth prepared herself, uncovered the feet of Boaz, which would be awakened in the night chill. In obedience to Naomi, she was faithful to her vow that she had given in chapter 1. And then there's a challenge, and Ruth challenges Boaz to redemption and marriage. And when she talks about spreading his skirt or wings over her, men would have a cloak that they would perhaps wear during the day, wear as a blanket at night. And she's speaking of the fact that she would find shelter or rest under his wings as much as Israel would find shelter under the protective wings of the Lord. But Ruth is a virtuous woman because she could have married for all kinds of reasons. Evidently, Boaz is considerably older than her, but she is faithful to the vow that she made at the beginning, and she will seek to marry so that there would be one who would be her kinsman redeemer. Well, there's a closer relative, of course, than Boaz, and so Boaz has some work to do. So usually it's the man who's waiting for the answer, but here it's Ruth who's waiting for the answer, which brings us to chapter 4, where Ruth is rejoicing. And Boaz acts in a very bold way to secure Ruth in the future and the family inheritance. And the result is, a very wonderful result, is Boaz and Ruth get married, a child. The women of the city now rejoice with Naomi, and Ruth had the joy of becoming a mother in Israel. Her son was Obed, and the grandfather of David, which leads us to the next book, because that's a book about David becoming king. And we learn in 1st and 2nd Samuel, we divide this. This is, although it's 2 books in our Bible, it's originally just 1 book, and we divide it into 3 sections, and we start with Samuel. But the purpose of Samuel is to reveal the Lord's faithfulness toward Israel in establishing his rule through Samuel, through Saul, and David, despite the people's unfaithfulness. And when we start with Samuel, it's again in the days of Judges. And God does something unique. When God brings about a birth, whether it's Isaac or whether it's Samson or John the Baptist, we know that God, or Moses, God is going to do something special. And so in answer to Hannah's prayer, Samuel is raised up. And he becomes a prophet. And in 1 Samuel 3:20, and all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. But Samuel was more than a prophet. He was a prophet, he was a priest, and he was a judge in Israel. And he was the most spiritual of all the judges. Really, God saved the best to last with Samuel. There's something, I'm going to call it a revival, for want of a better term, under Samuel. 1 Samuel 7:3 and 4, and Samuel spoke unto all the house of Israel, saying, If ye do return unto the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the strange gods and Ashtaroth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hands of the Philistines. Then the children of Israel did put away the Baalim and Ashtaroth, and served the Lord only. Well, what a wonderful thing that was. But he didn't just do that. He prayed for the nation. In verse 5 of chapter 7, gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray for you unto the Lord. Israel had not had a judge like him, but he was getting old. which brings us to Saul. And with Saul, there was a situation where Samuel made his two sons to be judges. And when he made his two sons to be judges, they were not good men. They were like the sons of Eli. And when he does this, what happens is that it seems like it's the same old cycle, Israel going down again. And in the hearts of the people had worldly kinds of hearts because they were looking at the nations around them and they wanted to be like the nations around them. And they thought if they had a king, it would solve all their problems. And this was, of course, prophesied in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, that the nation would have a king. And, of course, we need to be careful what we ask for, because Saul, even though he made a good beginning, and even though he was courageous in many ways, yet we find with him that he was impatient, didn't obey the Lord, he was rash. Chapter 14, especially when his son Jonathan won a great victory, but he was disobedient to God in chapter 15, and this lost him the kingship. Well, which brings us to David, and the rest of Samuel is concerned with David. And in the rest of 1 Samuel, we find the rise of David. In chapter 16, he's anointed by Samuel to be king. And then in chapter 17, he comes on the stage, as it were, of Israel when he wins a mighty victory. And this is marvelous. Until after that, there the women were singing, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And with that point, Saul became jealous. And that's really the story of what happens in the rest of 1 Samuel, because he went and even sought the life of King David. It was a time of growth for David, but David showed himself to be a godly man. He had stumbles, but he trusted the Lord, and he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. It was a testing time for David, but we come to 2 Samuel. And in 2 Samuel, David, now with the death of Saul, David is established as the king. And when he's established as the king, he's not immediately king over all of the nation of Israel, because Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, he's still there. And so there's quite a period in the early chapters before David reigns over the whole nation. But once he reigns over the whole nation, he then goes to Jerusalem. And what he does there is very important, because he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. That begins the process of establishing centralized worship in the nation, which is what God had wanted from Deuteronomy chapter 12. But until there was a temple, people would still sacrifice at the high places. And then in a most important chapter, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, David had desired to build a house for the Lord, but the Lord will build a house for David. And there, just as there back in Genesis, there's the Abrahamic covenant, and just as the covenant was made with Israel at Sinai, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God makes a covenant with David. And that covenant is vital for understanding what happens in the rest of the Bible. Because from that point, God is going to build a house for David. And when he's going to build a house for David, we find in the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, there's the expectation of one who will come from David, prophecies of a coming Messiah from the line of David. Well, in the next chapters, David's kingdom continues to be established, strengthened, blessed by the Lord. But then in chapter 11, there's the incident with Bathsheba. And from that point, although David is forgiven right through to chapter 20, verse 26, we find David bears the consequences of his sin, and particularly with the rebellion of Absalom, and also in chapter 20 with the rebellion of Sheba. That's the consequences. But there's a covenant being made with David, and David is not losing his kingdom like Saul did. God will be faithful. At the end of 2 Samuel, there's a number of incidents in the older life of David, but the last incident is very important. It's when David makes a census and he has to buy the threshing floor of Arona, and that threshing floor will become the place where the temple is established, which brings us to the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. And when we come to the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, it's important to note the purpose of the book of Kings. The purpose was to show how the Lord was faithful to his covenant with Israel and kept his word that Israel would be exiled from their land through disobedience. If we want to understand the book of Kings, we've got to start right at the end almost, because at the end we find there that Jehoiachin is in prison in Babylon. King Jehoiachin there, but after 37 years he's released, which gives promise that there will be hope for the future. But in the meantime, they were there because of their unfaithfulness. And the book of Kings tells us how Israel ended up in Babylonian captivity, how they were exiled. So with that, we find at the beginning that there is a united kingdom, and that united kingdom is under Solomon. And Solomon, of course, is a very great king, but the thing that is especially noticed is that he built the temple. And the building of the temple was important. David had brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, but now Solomon will build a temple that centralized worship and its centralized sacrifice. So everything would happen in Jerusalem, and the people were to no longer worship anywhere they liked, as it were, but it must be in Jerusalem. Well, he also in 1 Kings chapter 8 makes a prayer, a very long prayer, but he prays in his prayer that God, when the children of Israel sinned, that he would forgive them. And importantly, that when they sinned and ended up in exile, that they would look back to the Lord and the Lord would restore them. Well, Solomon sadly finishes on a bad note, because in chapter 11 it records Solomon's unfaithfulness, and for a number of years, because of his foreign wives, his moral compass, as it were, was being turned away from the Lord, and he was led away into idolatry. He was disobedient to the word in multiplying wives, in multiplying silver and gold, and he gave himself over to idols. David had many faults, but David never worshipped idols. Here, idolatry is found in the kingdom. Well, the result, of course, is that God promised that there would be a division in the kingdom. And so from there we find a divided kingdom, and that divided kingdom goes from 1 Kings chapter 12 to 2 Kings chapter 17. And at the beginning of that, we have the rise of Jeroboam. He's the king in the north. When the kingdom divides, there will be two nations, there will be two capitals, and there will be two religions. And having two kingdoms sometimes makes kings a little hard to read, because you've got to note, is this the king in the north or is this the king in the south? But with Jeroboam, he immediately did something bad. He moved politically. He did a political move so that he thought the people, because worship was centralized down in Jerusalem, he established idols at both ends, at the north end and the south end of his kingdom. And they were golden calves. He replaced the Levites, and he also replaced the feasts, so they had their own religion, as it were. This becomes very important in Kings, because after this point, when you read of the kings of the north, there's always this refrain. They're speaking about the fact that that king would continue in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. So it says, for example, 1 Kings 15:34, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin. They didn't remove the idols that he put up. By contrast, when you look at the refrain that comes with the kings of the north, they're always compared to King David. So, for example, we will read in 1 Kings 15 and verse 3 of a bad king in the south, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. But regarding a good king like King Asa, 1 Kings 15:11, and Asa did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did David his father. So those are important things to note. In 1 Kings chapter 16, there's the third family or house of kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. That's Omri's dynasty. And Omri covers a big portion of, or Omri's house, of the books of Kings. And he's a powerful king. And not only that, but the important thing that he did was, for his son Ahab, he got a wife, Jezebel, from the Sidonians, and she brought in Baal worship. So not only did the children of Israel have this idolatry at the northern and southern border of their kingdom, but they made, under Jezebel, it became like Baalism was the state religion. But God is very gracious, and God raised up the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and they railed with their miracles and with their messages against Baalism in the kingdom. Well, it was King Jehu in the south in 2 Kings that finally gets rid of the house of Omri. But even though he rids it of Baalism, he doesn't remove the idols that Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, had put there. And so with that, we come in 2 Kings 11 through 17, and this leads to the final decline of the northern kingdom. And in the final decline of the northern kingdom, interestingly enough, there's a king called Jeroboam II. And Jeroboam II, there's economic prosperity under Jeroboam II, but Israel still doesn't follow the Lord. And so it leads us to 2 Kings chapter 17, a key chapter for understanding the book of Kings, because in 2 Kings, it's Israel, the northern kingdom, goes into captivity in Assyria, and we learn the reason why they did it. It was because of their unfaithfulness to God. It was because of their idolatry, and they didn't listen to the prophets. But it also mentions there the reason why Judah would fail as well. Well, from chapter 18 and to the end of the book, we have the southern kingdom of Judah. And three kings, I think, stand out. Hezekiah, he's a very godly king. But when he sins through pride, it's made clear that the Babylonians are going to come and destroy the nation. Manasseh, Hezekiah's son, is an extremely wicked king. And Manasseh, this extremely wicked king, a long reign, what he does guarantees that God will not stay his hand with the northern kingdom. So Josiah, a reformer, and no one reformed like Josiah did. He was extraordinary, but when he dies, the die is cast, as it were, and the nation will go into captivity and into judgment. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the book, there is with this a word of hope. When at the end of the book, we read there that after 37 years, Jehoiachin is raised up and shown favor, God still has his hand on the line of David, and God is going to keep his hand on the line of David to bring the Messiah. Which brings us to the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And my approach with 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a little bit different because it's a different kind of book. And we need to understand a little bit about the structure of the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. I put the purpose of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It is to chronicle for the exiles the rule of David's house and the appointed services of the Levites as a record of how God's people keep faith. In short, there is great emphasis upon David's kingdom and Solomon's kingdom as an example to those who had returned from the Babylonian captivity. And importantly, in understanding the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, this is written to children of Israel who had returned to the land, had the temple built. This was a message to them to live faithful and to hope for one who would come from the line of David. Now, looking at this book, we've divided into 3 particular cycles. And I've got this up here. In the beginning of the cycle, that's the first 8 chapters of the book of 1st Chronicles. Remember, it's genealogy, and it's really tough reading through those genealogies. So let's kind of make sense of it. And with that genealogy, it begins with Adam, and the line of the Messiah is traced through the first 3 chapters through to David, and interestingly enough, there's a mention of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel led the children of Israel back to the land, and there is an account of the descendants of Zerubbabel. God has his hand on the line of Israel. In chapter 6, there's a real strong focus on the Levites and the priests and their genealogy, because only priests could offer sacrifice in the temple. And then in chapter 8, there is the genealogy of the Benjamites, which leads to King Saul. But interestingly enough, there's a statement, and it's in 1st Chronicles chapter 9 and verse 1. And what it says is, God, here we read, so all Israel were reckoned by genealogies, and behold, they were written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah, who were carried away to Babylon for their transgression. And then what we read about after this is the restoration. And you'll notice importantly in chapter 9, when you read 1st Chronicles, that it is a record of those who returned from the Babylonian captivity. God restores them. Well, then we enter into cycle number 2. And in cycle number 2, having gone to the genealogy of the exiles, you'd think, well, what next? He goes back to Saul. And there we have a record of King Saul and his genealogy carried on for 12 generations at that time. And then there is also, again, we find retribution for unfaithfulness. Very little is said about King Saul. And what we learn about King Saul was his unfaithfulness. He was disobedient to the prophet Samuel. He didn't get rid of the Amalekites, and he visited a medium at Endor. And because of that, um, he was replaced, as it were, and there is the restoration of the king in the kingdom in David. So if we read in 1 Samuel chapter 10 in verse 14, the first part of the law, the verse regarding King Saul, and inquired not of the Lord, therefore he slew him. Importantly, he turned the kingdom unto David, the son of Jesse, which brings us to the third and final cycle in the book. And in the third and final cycle in the book, we have a huge section, and it concerns King David and King Solomon alone. And this huge section containing David and Solomon alone, there's no mention of his war with Ishbosheth. It immediately goes to when he became king over a united kingdom. And it speaks of the fact that he was obedient to God. 1 Chronicles 14:16. David therefore did as God commanded him, and they smote the host of the Philistines from Gibeon unto Gaza. But you'll notice there a lot of what David did in 1 Chronicles is he's making preparation for the building of the temple. First, he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem again. Secondly, he makes extensive preparations for the building of the temple. And thirdly, he organizes worship there in various divisions with Levites in the temple. So the focus is on the temple. And you say, well, why is that? Judah didn't have a palace when they returned to the land, but they did have a temple, and they were to conform and follow the example given there by King David. And it's the same with Solomon. You turn over to 2 Chronicles and you read in the first 9 chapters of Solomon, of how he built the temple, and when he built the temple, and it speaks of the wealth and the splendor of his kingdom, and all the negative things that were said there regarding him are not said because they were to copy. The focus was to be on their worship as a faithful people that remain faithful while awaiting God to fulfill his promises to David. But we have retribution, and there's retribution by division of the kingdom, and the kingdom is divided. But even in the divided kingdom, there is a focus on always on the kings of Judah. And you'll notice how many of them were reformers. Many of them are good kings. This is a delight to read. And you read of Hezekiah, and you read of Jehoshaphat, you read of numbers of good kings, because they were to be examples to those who had come back from exile of how they were to live there by faith. But retribution is seen in a second way at the end of the book, where we find 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 14 through 21. And ultimately, they were sent into exile by Babylon. And importantly, it was the Lord who brought the Babylonians. This was divine judgment. But there's a word of restoration too. And the restoration is by King Cyrus. And there, Cyrus, following a prophecy of Jeremiah, announces that they would be brought back from the exile after the 70 years of captivity. So that's where the book of Chronicles ends. And I'm going to get into Ezra and Nehemiah, and really they're originally written as one book. So because of time, and I don't want to keep you, I'm going to cover that next week. Well, it's been probably a bit of a fire hose, so I hope you've been able to follow along. But just to give something of the structure and the sense and the flow of these books, and in the will of God, we'll look into this next Wednesday, and we'll also look at the books of poetry in from Job through the Song of Songs. And I'll hand it back over to Philip.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Ian, for taking us through all those books. I think tonight it was Joshua, Judges, Ruth,
Samuel.
First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. That's quite a lot to cover. So it's quite a feat. Yes. So we appreciate that. It's been quite fascinating having this overview, this sort of flow through of the whole flow of history and all the highlights and crucial parts of it. So it brings the scriptures more alive to us. So so we'll look forward to the next installment as we progress. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and I think we had a bit of a hiccup part way through there. I don't know if everyone else was all right with their reception. I actually got thrown out completely, and I had to go back in at one stage. So it kept saying I had low bandwidth or something. So
okay,
which I'm not quite sure what that means, but
hopefully nobody else had that problem. Yeah.
But still, we managed all right in the end. So the technology held up overall, which is good. It's always a concern,
Yeah.
The technology will keep going. But it's quite marvellous that we can come together by means of technology and do these studies.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we'll bring everything to a conclusion now, and all the best until next Wednesday. We carry on further. Right. So God bless, and we'll catch up again.